July 1943. Somewhere over the Ruhr Valley, the sky is on fire. 1,000 aircraft are crossing the North Sea in darkness. Their engines hum in unison, a deep, relentless drone that the people below have learned to fear. They are heading for Hamburg, and they are carrying something terrible. In 10 days, this single raid will claim more civilian lives than the entire Blitz over Britain. 45,000 souls, 400,000 left without homes. The first firestorm in human history, created not by nature, but by design. The Germans had a name for this. They called it the Second Front, a war they were losing, not on the ground, not at sea, but in the night sky, every single night, from the first day of the war to the very last. 156,000 sorties, 608,000 tons of bombs, more destruction than any air force in history had ever delivered, and almost all of it carried by a single aircraft, the Avro Lancaster. But here is what most people do not know. The Lancaster was never supposed to exist. It was born from a disaster, from a machine so flawed, so dangerous, that it was claiming the lives of its own crews before the enemy ever got a chance. Pilots called it a flying coffin, and they were not exaggerating. So how did Britain's greatest shame become Britain's greatest weapon? The answer lies with one man. A quiet engineer from Lancashire who believed that if an aircraft looked right, it would fly right. A man who turned catastrophe into legend, who built the bomber that broke the Reich, and who never lived to see the glory of what he had created. His name was Roy Chadwick, and this is his story. Roy Chadwick came into this world on the 30th of April, 1893, in a place called Marsh Hall Farm near the town of Widnes in Lancashire. It was an industrial corner of England caught somewhere between Liverpool and Manchester, a land of factories, coal smoke, and men who worked with their hands. His father, Charles Chadwick, was a mechanical engineer. His grandfather had been an engineer, and his grandfather before him. 5 generations of men who understood machines, who could look at a problem and see the solution hiding inside it. Engineering was not something Roy Chadwick learned, it was something he inherited, like the color of his eyes. At the age of 14, while other boys were still in school, young Roy walked through the gates of the British Westinghouse Electrical Company in Trafford Park. He was there to become a draftsman, an apprentice, the lowest rung on the ladder. But here is the thing about Roy Chadwick. He was not content to climb slowly. During the day he worked at his drawing board, learning the discipline of precision, the language of lines and angles. But when the factory closed and other apprentices went home to rest, Roy went to school. Night classes at the Manchester College of Technology. 4 years of studying while the city slept. From 1907 to 1911, he split his life between 2 worlds and excelled in both. Then, in September of 1911, everything changed. A man named Elliot Verdon Rowe had started a small aircraft company in Manchester. They called it A.V. Rowe and Company, or simply Avro. At the time, aviation was not an industry. It was a dream held together by wood, fabric, and audacity. The Wright brothers had flown only 8 years earlier. Most people still believed that heavier-than-air flight was a passing novelty. Roy Chadwick was 18 years old when he walked into Brownsfield Mill and became the personal assistant to Elliot Verdon Rowe himself. He was also the company's draftsman. In fact, he was one of very few employees the tiny firm could afford. It was not glamorous. The pay was modest. The hours were long. But for a young man who had spent his childhood sketching machines in the margins of his notebooks, it was everything. Years later, those who worked alongside Chadwick would struggle to describe him. One colleague, the aviation historian Harold Penrose, found the words that came closest. He called Chadwick artistic, with unbounded enthusiasm and unsparing energy. A great designer of intuitive diagnostic ability rather than a scientist. A man who was always in step with the tide of knowledge and contemporary outlook. But perhaps the truest insight into Roy Chadwick came from his own working method. He believed in something that sounds almost too simple to be profound. If it looks right, it flies right. Whenever a new aircraft was assembled, Chadwick would walk around it, slowly, silently. He would study it from every angle, looking for something that no equation could capture. A curve that felt wrong, a proportion that seemed unbalanced. He trusted his eye the way a musician trusts his ear, and more often than not, his eye was correct. This was the man who would one day build the Lancaster, not a scientist surrounded by computers, but an artist armed with a pencil, a slide rule, and an instinct that bordered on the supernatural. But in 1911, all of that was still decades away. For now, Roy Chadwick was just a teenager in a drafty workshop, dreaming of machines that could fly. The First World War arrived, and suddenly aviation was no longer a curiosity. It was a weapon. And in 1915, Roy Chadwick was given his first solo project. He was 22 years old. The aircraft was called the Avro Pike. It does not look impressive in photographs, a twin-engine pusher biplane, awkward by modern standards. But the Pike carried an innovation that would echo through history. It was the first bomber ever designed with an internal bomb bay. Before this, bombs simply hung outside the aircraft, creating drag. Chadwick imagined a hidden compartment within the fuselage. It seems obvious now. In 1915, it was revolutionary. By 1918, the war was ending. Roy Chadwick was 25, and Avro made him chief designer. 25 years old, leading the entire design department. It was either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary desperation, perhaps both. But Chadwick proved them right almost immediately. In 1920, he unveiled the Avro Aldershot, a single-engine bomber with a wingspan stretching nearly 100 feet, the largest single-engine bomber in the world. The Royal Air Force took notice. But success in aviation comes with a price. In 1921, Chadwick nearly paid it in full. He was testing his own creation, the Avro baby. Something went wrong. The aircraft crashed into trees. His arm was broken, his leg was broken, his pelvis was shattered, and the control stick was driven through his neck. He should not have survived. But Roy Chadwick recovered, slowly, painfully, stubbornly. And when he could walk again, he went back to the drawing board. 5 years later, in 1926, he completed the Avro Avian, a small, elegant biplane for long-distance flight. In 1928, an Australian pilot named Bert Hinkler climbed into an Avian in England and flew it solo to Australia. 15 days, 11,000 miles, the first solo flight from England to Australia in history. The machine that carried him was designed by Roy Chadwick. But perhaps his most important pre-war achievement came in 1935, the Avro Anson. Crews called it Faithful Annie. It was not glamorous, not fast, but nearly 11,000 were built. Pilots across the empire learned to fly in Ansons. It was exactly the kind of aircraft that wins wars. By the late 1930s, Chadwick had designed trainers, bombers, record breakers. He had survived a crash that should have ended him, but everything so far was merely preparation. The Air Ministry was about to issue a new specification, and Roy Chadwick would answer it, first with a disaster, then with a legend. 1936. Europe was holding its breath. Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland. War was coming, and Britain was not ready. The Air Ministry issued a new specification, P-13/36. They wanted a twin-engine medium bomber capable of striking deep into enemy territory. Roy Chadwick answered the call. But he made a choice that would haunt him for years. He selected the Rolls-Royce Vulture. The Vulture was a monster on paper, an X-configuration engine, essentially two smaller Peregrine engines stacked one on top of the other. 24 cylinders promising 1,760 horsepower. Two Vultures would give the Manchester more than 3,500 horsepower total. That was the theory. The reality was a nightmare. On the 25th of July, 1939, the prototype Manchester flew for the first time. It was unstable. It wanted to drift off course. They added a third fin to the tail, an awkward fix for an awkward problem. In November 1940, the Manchester entered service with 207 Squadron at RAF Waddington. Britain had been at war for over a year. Bomber Command desperately needed new aircraft. The Manchester was supposed to be the answer. It was not. February 1941, 6 Manchesters took off for their first combat mission, a raid on the French port of Brest. It was a disaster. Engines caught fire, aircraft returned with mechanical failures that had nothing to do with enemy action. One of the original pilots described it plainly. The aircraft itself was good, he said. Avro were excellent at modifications. But the engines never were and never did become reliable. 2 engines of 1,750 horsepower each, trying to haul 50,000 pounds of aircraft. In April 1941, every Manchester in service was grounded. All of them. The Vulture's main bearings were failing. The cause was absurd. Bearings manufactured without silver to save money. They simply fell apart. They fixed the bearings. The Manchesters returned. In June 1941, they were grounded again. The oil was losing viscosity 5 times faster than expected. When the oil failed, the engines seized, often catastrophically. The statistics were grim. Of 200 Manchesters built, 77 were lost in combat. 44 more crashed in training or routine flights. At least 30 of those losses were directly caused by engine failure. If one Vulture failed in flight, you had a 75% chance of not making it home. 3 out of 4 crews who lost an engine never landed safely. Pilots had a name for it, the flying coffin. One witness saw a Manchester on the ground, engines running before a flight. As he watched, 2 pistons came straight out through the side of the engine casing. The connecting rods had failed. The pistons tore through the metal wall like it was paper. Roy Chadwick watched young men paying for his choice with their lives, but he did not make excuses. He did not blame Rolls-Royce. He went back to the drawing board, because he understood something crucial. The Manchester's airframe was sound. The enormous bomb bay was genuine innovation. The problem was not the aircraft. The problem was the engines. And Roy Chadwick already had an idea that would transform Britain's greatest failure into its greatest weapon. By the winter of 1940 to 1941, the Air Ministry had seen enough. The Manchester was consuming resources, consuming time, and consuming the lives of irreplaceable aircrew. Voices in Whitehall called for the program to be cancelled entirely. Scrap the Manchester, write off the losses, move on. But Roy Chadwick refused to give up. He had walked around this aircraft 100 times, studying every curve, every angle. His instinct told him the Manchester was not fundamentally flawed. The airframe was sound. The fuselage was strong. That enormous bomb bay was a genuine achievement. The problem had always been the engines. And if the engines were the problem, The solution was obvious: replace them. Chadwick went to the Air Ministry with a radical proposal. Take the Manchester airframe, extend the wingspan from 90 feet to 102 feet. Remove the two Vulture engines entirely, and in their place, install 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins. The Merlin, the same engine powering the Spitfire over southern England, the same engine keeping the Hurricane in the fight during the Battle of Britain. Each Merlin produced around 1,280 horsepower, less than a single Vulture was supposed to deliver. But the Merlin had something the Vulture never possessed: reliability. Merlins worked. They started when you needed them. They ran when you needed them. And if one failed, you still had 3 others to bring you home. The Air Ministry was desperate. If Chadwick believed he could salvage the program, let him try. The conversion happened with remarkable speed. In a matter of weeks, Avro stretched the wings and mounted 4 Merlins where 2 Vultures had been. They called it the Manchester Mark III. On the 9th of January 1941, this new creation lifted off from Ringway Aerodrome. Test pilot Sam Brown pushed the throttles forward. The 4 Merlins roared to life. It flew. But more than that, it flew beautifully. The handling was transformed. The additional wingspan gave stability and grace the original Manchester never possessed. The directional instability was gone. The third fin was no longer necessary. Within weeks, it was clear this was not a modified Manchester. This was something entirely new. They called it the Lancaster. And suddenly, everything that had been weakness became strength. That cavernous bomb bay could now be used to its full potential. With 4 reliable engines, the Lancaster could lift payloads no other Allied bomber could match. Consider the numbers. The American B-17 Flying Fortress carried a typical bomb load of around 4,000 pounds, about 1.8 tons. The Lancaster, in standard configuration, carried 14,000 pounds, more than 6 tons. With modifications, specialized Lancasters would carry 22,000 pounds, 10 tons in a single aircraft, nearly 4 times the payload of a B-17. Roy Chadwick had not merely fixed a broken aircraft, he had created a weapon that would reshape the entire strategic bombing campaign. A machine that could carry bombs no other aircraft could lift. The flying coffin was gone. In its place stood the aircraft that Bomber Harris would call his shining sword. April 1942. The Lancaster entered combat for the first time. And from that moment forward, the nature of the air war over Europe changed. Bomber Command finally had a weapon that matched its ambitions, an aircraft that could carry the war deep into the heart of Nazi Germany, night after night, in numbers that would darken the sky. On the night of the 30th of May 1942, Air Marshal Arthur Harris launched the most audacious bombing raid in history. Operation Millennium. 1,000 bombers over a single target, the city of Cologne. Among them flew the new Lancasters. In just 90 minutes, more than 2,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries fell on the ancient city beside the Rhine. 45,000 people were left without homes in a single night. 600 acres of the historic center were reduced to rubble. It was a statement, a demonstration of what Bomber Command could now achieve, and the Lancaster was at the heart of it. Harris called the Lancaster his shining sword. He wrote those words after the war, and he meant them. Without the Lancaster, the strategic bombing campaign as he envisioned it would have been impossible. But Harris was not alone in his assessment. On the other side of the conflict, the commander of Luftwaffe fighters, Adolf Galland, reached the same conclusion. He called the Lancaster the best night bomber of the war. Coming from an enemy, that judgment carries weight. The statistics tell the story of what this aircraft accomplished. 156,000 sorties flown between 1942 and 1945. 608,000 tons of bombs dropped on enemy targets. More than half of the entire tonnage delivered by Bomber Command throughout the war came from Lancaster bomb bays. 7,377 Lancasters were built. 40,000 workers across Britain were engaged in their production. 6 million square feet of factory space dedicated to a single aircraft design. By any measure, it was an industrial achievement as remarkable as the engineering itself. But statistics do not capture what the Lancaster meant in practice. For that, you need to look at Hamburg. July and August, 1943. Operation Gomorrah. A sustained assault on Germany's second-largest city. Night after night, hundreds of Lancasters crossed the North Sea, dropped their bombs, and returned to do it again. On the night of the 27th of July, something happened that no one had predicted. The concentration of incendiary bombs was so intense, the fires so numerous and so close together, that they merged into something new. Something terrible. A firestorm. The flames grew so hot that they consumed the oxygen in the air. Winds of hurricane force rushed inward to feed the inferno, reaching speeds of 150 miles per hour. Temperatures at the center exceeded 1,000 degrees. Asphalt in the streets caught fire. People in air raid shelters suffocated as the flames stole the air they needed to breathe. 45,000 souls were lost in Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah. 400,000 more were left without homes. In 10 days, more civilians perished than in the entire Blitz over Britain. Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, understood what was happening. He called the air war a second front, a campaign that Germany was losing every night. Resources that should have gone to the Eastern Front were diverted to defend the skies over the Reich. Fighters, anti-aircraft guns, radar installations, searchlights, all pulled away from the ground war to fight the bombers. And the bomber that carried the heaviest load, that flew the most missions, that delivered the most destruction, was the Lancaster. Roy Chadwick's aircraft had become the instrument of strategic devastation on a scale never before seen in warfare. The flying coffin was now a flying fortress of a different kind. Not defending, but attacking. Not surviving, but destroying. May 1943. While Bomber Command was hammering the Ruhr Valley with conventional raids, a different kind of operation was taking shape. One that would require the Lancaster to do something it was never designed to do. A man named Barnes Wallace had come to the Air Ministry with an idea that sounded like madness. Wallace was an engineer at Vickers, a designer of airships and aircraft. He had been studying the German war economy, looking for vulnerabilities. And he found one. The great dams of the Ruhr Valley, the Mona, the Eder, the Sorpe. They held back billions of gallons of water that powered the hydroelectric plants and steel mills of German industry. Break the dams, and you break the industrial heart of the Reich. But how do you break a dam? These were not ordinary structures. They were massive walls of concrete and stone, designed to withstand enormous pressure. Conventional bombs would simply bounce off or explode on the surface, causing superficial damage. Wallace devised a solution that seemed impossible. A cylindrical bomb, 4.5 tons in weight, designed to spin backwards at 500 revolutions per minute. Released at precisely 60 feet above the water, traveling at exactly 230 miles per hour, the spinning bomb would skip across the surface like a stone, bounce over the torpedo nets protecting the dam, strike the face of the dam wall, roll down beneath the water, and explode at the base, where the pressure was greatest. It was brilliant, it was audacious, and there was only one aircraft in the world that could carry it: the Lancaster. But not any Lancaster. The standard bomb bay was too small. The weapon was too heavy, too awkward. Barnes-Wallis needed modifications that would push the aircraft beyond its original design. Roy Chadwick answered the call. His team stripped out the bomb bay doors entirely. They designed special mounting struts that held the cylindrical bomb beneath the fuselage, half exposed to the airstream. They added a motor to spin the weapon before release, and they installed twin spotlights under the wings, angled so their beams would converge on the water's surface at exactly 60 feet, giving the pilot a precise altitude reference in the darkness. The modified Lancasters looked unlike anything that had flown before. They were ungainly, improvised, purpose-built for a single mission. Bomber Harris selected a young wing commander named Guy Gibson to lead the attack. Gibson was 24 years old, already a veteran of more than 170 missions. He was given permission to handpick his crews from across Bomber Command. They formed 617 Squadron. Their target was classified. Their training was brutal. Low-level flying over British reservoirs night after night, perfecting the approach until they could hit a precise release point in total darkness. On the night of the 16th of May, 1943, 19 Lancasters took off from RAF Scampton. Operation Chastise had begun. They flew at treetop height across the North Sea and occupied Europe, dodging power lines and church steeples, navigating by moonlight reflected on rivers and canals. German flak batteries opened fire as they passed. 2 aircraft were lost before they even reached the dams. At the Mona Dam, the first bombs fell wide. The second struck but failed to breach. The third, the fourth, the dam held. Then the 5th bomb, dropped by squadron leader Maltby, found its mark. The wall crumbled. A torrent of water exploded into the valley below. They moved on to the Eder Dam. More attempts. More near misses. Finally, a breach. The Sorpa Dam, with its different construction, survived with damage but intact. Of the 19 Lancasters that took off that night, 8 never returned. 53 young men were lost, trapped in burning aircraft, drowned in flooded valleys, or cut apart by German anti-aircraft fire. Below the broken dams, the released floodwaters swept through villages and factory towns. Approximately 1,600 people perished in the deluge, many of them forced laborers from occupied countries, prisoners who had no chance to escape. The Dambusters raid became legend. Guy Gibson received the Victoria Cross. The survivors of 617 Squadron became the most famous bomber crews in Britain, and Roy Chadwick received the CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, specifically for his work modifying the Lancaster to carry Barnes-Wallis's impossible weapon. The raid proved something beyond its immediate tactical value. It proved that the Lancaster could be adapted, modified, transformed to meet challenges that no one had imagined when it was designed. The aircraft that began as a salvage project was now the most versatile heavy bomber in the world. Barnes-Wallis did not stop at the dams. The bouncing bomb had proven a concept, that unconventional weapons carried by unconventional means could achieve what ordinary bombs could not. And Wallis had more ideas. His next creation was called Tallboy. It was not a bomb in the conventional sense. It was an earthquake. 12,000 pounds of steel and explosive, 5.4 tons, shaped like a teardrop, with fins that made it spin as it fell. Released from 20,000 feet, The Tallboy would accelerate to supersonic speed, plunge nose first into the earth, and bury itself deep beneath the target before detonating. The explosion did not destroy from above, it destroyed from below. The shock wave rippled through the ground like an earthquake, collapsing bunkers, cracking foundations, undermining structures that no surface bomb could touch. And once again, there was only one aircraft that could carry it, the Lancaster. No other Allied bomber had a bomb bay large enough, a structure strong enough, or engines powerful enough to lift the Tallboy and deliver it with precision. The weapon and the aircraft were made for each other. On the 12th of November, 1944, 31 Lancasters from 617 Squadron and 9 Squadron took off for a mission that had been attempted twice before and failed. Their target was the German battleship Tirpitz, hiding in a Norwegian fjord. The Tirpitz was the largest warship in the German fleet, a monster of 42,000 tons, bristling with guns, protected by anti-aircraft batteries and torpedo nets. The Royal Navy had tried to sink her with submarines, with midget submarines, with carrier aircraft. She survived them all, a constant threat that tied down British naval resources simply by existing. The Lancasters approached from the east, climbing over the Swedish mountains to avoid detection. The Tirpitz's defenders spotted them too late. The flak opened up, but the bombers held their course. There is a number that must be spoken, a number that hangs over everything we have discussed so far, like a shadow that never lifts. 55,573. That is how many young men from Bomber Command never came home. Not wounded, not captured, gone. 44.4% of everyone who served, nearly half. No other branch of British military service suffered losses like this. Not the infantry, not the Royal Navy, not even Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain. The men who flew the bombers faced odds that would have broken most units, and they flew anyway, night after night, year after year. The average age of a Lancaster crew was barely past 20. Boys, really, teenagers who had learned to fly, to navigate, to operate complex machinery, and then climbed into an aircraft knowing that the statistics were not in their favor. A tour of duty was 30 operations. Complete 30 missions, and you could be rotated out, sent to a training unit, given a rest. 30 flights over enemy territory. 30 nights of searchlights and flak and night fighters. Statistically, most crews did not survive their tour. The mathematics were brutal. If the loss rate was 5% per mission, and some periods saw rates much higher, then after 30 operations, your cumulative chance of survival was barely 1 in 4. 3 out of 4 crews who began a tour never finished it. 3,249 Lancasters were lost in action. Each one carried 7 men. Some were brought down by flak, the anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky over every German city. Some fell to night fighters, the twin-engine Messerschmitts and Junkers that hunted in the darkness. But many were destroyed by a weapon the crews never even saw. The Germans called it schräge Musik, jazz music. It was a pair of upward-firing cannons mounted in the fuselage of a night fighter, angled at 60 degrees. The fighter would approach from below, invisible against the dark ground, and position itself directly beneath the bomber. Then it would fire upward, into the belly of the Lancaster, into the fuel tanks and the bomb bay. The first warning the crew received was the explosion. Bomber Command did not discover the existence of schräge Musik for months. They knew aircraft were being lost. They did not know how. The Lancasters had no belly turret, no observer watching the darkness below. Hundreds of bombers were shot down by fighters they never detected, crews who had no chance to evade, no chance to fight back. no chance to do anything but burn. Even when the tactic was understood, no effective countermeasure was ever developed. The young men simply continued to fly, knowing that something invisible might be waiting beneath them. And yet, they returned. Every night that the weather permitted, they returned. From the first day of the war to the very last, Bomber Command flew. The Lancaster carried them across the North Sea and back, again and again, until the war was won, or until their luck ran out. Today, there is a memorial in Green Park, London. Bronze statues of a bomber crew, standing together, looking toward the sky. 55,000 names represented by 7 figures. Roy Chadwick designed the aircraft, but he could not protect the men who flew it. He gave them the best machine he knew how to build. What happened after takeoff was beyond his control. The war ended in May of 1945. The Lancasters that had carried destruction across Europe were suddenly without a purpose. But Roy Chadwick was already looking forward. He had designed an aircraft called the Avro York during the war years, a transport plane built using Lancaster wings, tail, and engines married to a new square fuselage that could carry passengers or cargo. It was practical, unglamorous work, but it would prove essential. In 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin. The city was surrounded, cut off from all ground supply routes. The Western Allies responded with the largest airlift in history, flying food, fuel, and medicine into the besieged city around the clock. Avro Yorks carried 1/3 of the entire British tonnage during the Berlin airlift. Roy Chadwick's aircraft, born from the Lancaster, helped save 2 million people from starvation. He also developed the Avro Lincoln, a direct evolution of the Lancaster with a longer range and higher operational ceiling. It was the bridge between the propeller age and what came next. Because Chadwick was already dreaming of the future. In 1946, he began work on something radical. An aircraft unlike anything Britain had built before. A jet-powered bomber with a massive delta wing. A triangular shape that seemed to belong in science fiction rather than an engineering office. He called it the Avro Vulcan. The Vulcan was designed to carry nuclear weapons. It would fly at high altitude, at speeds approaching that of sound, delivering the ultimate deterrent deep into Soviet territory if the Cold War ever turned hot. The delta wing that Chadwick pioneered would later influence the design of Concorde. But Roy Chadwick never saw the Vulcan fly. Alongside the military projects, he was developing the Avro Tudor, Britain's first pressurized airliner. It was meant to compete with American aircraft on transatlantic routes, a symbol of British aviation ambition in the post-war world. The Tudor had problems, stability issues, design changes demanded by the airlines, delays and modifications that stretched the program beyond its original timeline. But by August of 1947, the prototype Tudor II was ready for flight testing. On the 23rd of August, 1947, Roy Chadwick arrived at Woodford Aerodrome. He was 54 years old. He had spent 36 years at Avro, designing aircraft that had shaped aviation history, and today he would fly in the Tudor II. The test pilot was Bill Thorne, Avro's chief test pilot. Also aboard were David Wilson, the chief of the test section, and John Webster, the radio operator. Roy Chadwick took his seat. The engines started. The Tudor rolled down the runway. It lifted off. Thorne began a gentle turn to the right, and the left wing dropped toward the ground. He corrected. The aircraft did not respond. The wing dropped further. The Tudor was rolling in the wrong direction, against the pilot's inputs. During overnight servicing, a mechanic had made a mistake. The aileron control cables had been crossed. connected in reverse. When Thorne moved the control column to raise the left wing, the ailerons did the opposite. The aircraft was fighting him. They had no altitude, no time. Thorne cut the engines and tried to bring the Tudor down in a field near Sherfold Farm. They almost made it, but there was a pond in the field, surrounded by trees. The Tudor struck the trees. The nose broke away. Roy Chadwick was gone. Bill Thorne was gone. David Wilson and John Webster, gone. 4 men lost because of a crossed wire. 2 others aboard survived. Stuart Davies, who would later become Avro's chief designer, was pulled from the wreckage. But the man who had built the Lancaster, the man who had given Bomber Command its shining sword, was no longer there. He never saw the Vulcan take to the sky. He never saw his aircraft carrying nuclear weapons on alert, defending Britain through the long decades of the Cold War. He never stood in a museum and watched visitors stare up at a Lancaster, wondering at the machine that had helped win the war. Roy Chadwick was buried in the churchyard of Christ Church, Woodford, a short distance from the runway where his final flight had ended. He had designed over 40 aircraft in his lifetime. He had survived a crash that should have ended him 26 years earlier. But this time, there was no recovery, no return to the drawing board. The man who believed that if it looked right, it would fly right, was gone. And the aircraft he left behind would fly for decades to come. Today, 2 Lancasters still fly. The city of Lincoln in Britain, the Mynarski Memorial in Canada. 2 aircraft out of 7,377. That is all that remains in the sky. But when they fly, something happens. At air shows, when the Lancaster appears on the horizon, people stop. Conversations fade. Children point. Veterans stand a little straighter, and everyone listens. The sound of 4 Merlins is unlike anything else. A deep, resonant thunder that rolls across the countryside. It is not just the roar of engines, it is the voice of a generation. 55,000 young men who flew into the darkness, knowing each mission might be their last. Roy Chadwick did not build aeroplanes. He built the weapon that broke the backbone of Nazi Germany. The aircraft that carried the war to the enemy when no one else could. The platform for Barnes Wallace's impossible bombs. And he did it by refusing to accept failure. The Manchester should have ended his career, but Chadwick looked at that disaster and saw potential. He took a failure and transformed it into a legend. 156,000 sorties, 608,000 tons of bombs. One man from Lancashire who started as an apprentice draftsman. He never saw the glory. He was gone at 54, claimed by a crossed cable. But what he built endures. When the Lancaster passes overhead at air shows today, Roy Chadwick is still there. In every rivet, in every curve of the wing, in the proportions he studied until they looked right. Because he believed something simple. If it looks right, it flies right. And 80 years later, it still flies.